My name is Daniel Ross, and I knew I was walking into a storm the moment I saw him. He was leaning back in his chair, one ankle resting casually over his knee, twirling a cheap silver pen like it was some kind of status symbol. The blinds were half drawn, slicing the midday light into sharp stripes across his desk. And there it was, that smug half-smile, the kind you see in people who've never actually built anything but believe they're entitled to own it. I didn't even get a hello. He just flicked his chin toward the chair across from him, a silent command rather than an invitation. His voice, smooth but laced with condescension, broke the quiet. "Daniel, I need you to clear out your old files. They belong to the company now." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My old files weren't just random clutter or personal documents. They were the backbone of the payroll system I had built over 12 years, custom-coded modules, encrypted access logs, automated compliance scripts. Every paycheck that went out on time, every tax report that matched to the cent, every system upgrade that avoided catastrophe, it all came from the architecture I'd designed and maintained. So I asked, slowly letting each word settle in the air, "You want me to delete the payroll system files?" He scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "They're not payroll system files, just clutter. We're moving to a team-owned approach. No one person should control these things. You've been holding too much close to the chest." That last line wasn't about efficiency. It was a calculated jab. I'd seen this tactic before: paint the veteran as territorial and outdated, then replace him with someone younger, cheaper, and far less experienced. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, but I kept my expression neutral. Over the years, I'd learned that in rooms like this, the calmest man often wins. "Just so I'm clear," I said, locking eyes with him, "you're asking me to delete the file." He nodded, smirking as if the conversation was over. He didn't know he couldn't know that with that small, careless nod he'd just signed the death warrant for his career. What he thought was an old file was in fact the master encryption key, an irreplaceable piece of code that authenticated every single payroll transaction. Without it, the system would lock itself down tighter than Fort Knox. There was no magic restore button, no backup floating somewhere in a cloud drive. By law, that key existed only on a secure local drive, regenerated once every few years under strict compliance protocols. I was the only authorized administrator. And now, because his ego was bruised, that something important didn't have his fingerprints on it, he wanted it gone. Inside, a part of me was already mapping the endgame. Outwardly, I nodded, a faint curve tugging at my mouth. All right. I left the office without another word and began the slow walk back to my desk. Every step felt deliberate, heavy, with the clarity of someone who knows exactly what will happen next. It wasn't adrenaline pumping through my veins, it was something colder, steadier. I could already see the sequence of events that would follow, and I had no intention of stopping it. Sometimes you don't need to fight for power. You just need to be patient enough to let the other person hand it to you. And that's exactly what he'd just done. I didn't go straight to my desk. I made a slow loop around the office floor, letting my mind run the numbers. Not payroll numbers this time, but the odds. In all my years managing critical infrastructure, I'd never had anyone so recklessly walk themselves into the crosshairs. This was more than arrogance. It was ignorance with a badge of authority. And ignorance with authority, that's a ticking time bomb. I finally slid into my chair and unlocked my terminal. The familiar hum of the system felt like the steady pulse of a living thing, something I'd nurtured, protected, and refined for over a decade. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't type just yet. I looked around the room instead. There was Kelly from Accounts Payable tapping away at her calculator like she was trying to beat a personal record. Across the aisle, Jake from IT was muttering to himself, probably debugging another printer issue. And then there were the two interns by the coffee machine laughing about some meme they'd just found. They had no idea that the lifeline of every paycheck in this building was hanging by a thread. Before I moved forward, I thought about something I learned early in my career. When you're holding a winning position, don't rush the play. Make it deliberate. Make it count. I knew there was one thing I needed to do before pressing that final sequence of commands. I needed witnesses. Not in the dramatic courtroom sense, but in the digital sense, records that could outlast any spin or cover-up attempt. That meant a precise audit log time-stamped untouchable. I began crafting the log entry in a separate document, carefully choosing my words: deleted payroll master encryption file per manager instruction. No emotion, no adjectives, Just a surgical fact that would at the right moment cut deeper than any insult ever could. As I typed, I felt that old familiar pull, the one I get when I'm telling a story worth remembering. And speaking of stories, if you're watching this right now and you've been through something similar, I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment telling me the wildest, most reckless order you've ever been given by a boss. Not only does it help others realize they're not alone in these situations, but your stories might just be the reminder someone needs to hold their ground. And if you haven't already hit that subscribe button, we're building a community here where we share these battles, dissect them, and make sure we all come out smarter, sharper, and a little bit tougher. Now back to that moment. I saved the draft of the log and opened the secure console, staring at the directory where the file lived. To anyone else, it looked like a harmless line of alphanumeric characters buried in a maze of folders. To me, it was a loaded chamber. One command and the bullet would leave the barrel. I thought back to all the times I'd tried to protect the system from bad decisions. There was the year the finance VP tried to save costs by outsourcing encryption to a third-party vendor with a questionable security record. Or the time a junior manager decided we could skip a compliance audit because no one ever checks those. Every time I'd been the quiet barrier between them and a disaster they couldn't even imagine. This time, though, there would be no barrier. Not because I couldn't stop it, but because I wouldn't. I leaned back in my chair and watched the light from my monitor dance on the framed certificate on my wall, certified payroll systems security expert. I'd earned it through years of work, late nights, and the kind of mistakes you only make once. That certificate wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof that I understood the weight of what I was about to do better than anyone else in this building. The decision wasn't about revenge, at least not entirely. It was about setting a precedent. If someone was going to dismantle my work, they were going to own every inch of that decision, and they were going to do it in a way no one could ever deny. I pulled the keyboard closer, the keys cool under my fingertips. The cursor blinked like it was impatient. My heart rate didn't spike. My hands didn't shake. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was an act of clarity. With one deep breath, I began typing the commands. Not fast, not slow, just steady. Every keystroke was deliberate, each one sealing another inch of the vault. When it was done, I didn't slam the enter key. I pressed it softly, like closing a door without making a sound. The system responded instantly, the file disappearing into digital oblivion. I finalized the audit log, pasted the exact wording, and hit save. Somewhere across the floor, I heard my boss laughing with another manager. He had no idea the fuse was already lit under his own chair. I closed my eyes for just a moment, letting the hum of the office wash over me. The game had begun, and I was already holding checkmate. The next morning started like any other, or at least it looked that way to everyone else. I parked my car in my usual spot, sipped the last of my coffee, and walked into the building with the same measured pace I always had. If there's one thing I've learned in corporate warfare, it's that the most dangerous moves are made under the guise of normalcy. By the time I reached my desk, I had already rehearsed the conversation in my head a dozen times. It wasn't about what I'd say, it was about what I wouldn't say. Letting someone dig their own grave is an art form, and I wasn't about to rush the masterpiece. I saw him coming down the hall, that same swagger in his step, like he owned every square foot of the place. He stopped by a couple of desks, tossed out a few forced laughs, and made a show of being approachable leadership. But I could see the glint in his eye, the quiet satisfaction of a man who thought he'd just taken control of something too big for me to hoard. He passed my desk without a word, but our eyes met for half a second. I let mine linger just long enough to register that I'd heard his order, followed it to the letter, and carried no trace of regret. He nodded almost imperceptibly before disappearing into his office. That nod was important. It was another layer of acknowledgement, another invisible signature tying him to what had been done. I turned back to my monitor, pulling up the secure console again. The directory where the master encryption key had once lived was still empty, just as I'd left it. I clicked into the audit log, not because I doubted myself, but because I liked seeing the evidence in black and white deleted payroll master encryption file per manager instruction. Reading it was like feeling the lock click into place on a vault door. Permanent, undeniable, irreversible. You see, in payroll systems, especially ones built for compliance with U.S. labor and tax laws, the master key isn't just a password. It's a cryptographic handshake, a living signature that allows every transaction to pass through secure channels. Lose it, and you might as well try paying 2,000 employees with monopoly money. The rebuild process isn't just technical, it's bureaucratic, crawling through legal sign-offs, compliance checks, and vendor certifications. It takes weeks, sometimes months, and it's expensive. He hadn't asked a question about any of that when he gave the order. That told me everything I needed to know about how this would play out. Around mid-morning, I saw the first ripple. A payroll clerk named Jenna came over looking uneasy. "Hey, Daniel. Did you move the key file to another directory I can't get the system to authenticate?" I shrugged lightly. I followed a management directive yesterday. "You might want to check with him." I didn't point toward his office. I didn't have to. She knew exactly who I meant. She walked away with a frown, and I leaned back in my chair, keeping my posture loose. The tension wasn't mine to carry, it was his. From where I sat, I could see his door half open. He was on the phone talking too fast, his free hand chopping the air in short, frustrated gestures. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. The sequence was predictable disbelief, irritation, defensiveness, and eventually, fear. By late morning, that sequence had accelerated. It had been looped in. I saw two of their senior techs hustling toward the server room, the kind of pace that says, "This is bad," without a single word. They didn't make eye contact with me, which told me they either hadn't read the audit log yet, or they had and knew exactly whose side of the line I was standing on. I tapped my pen against my desk, counting the beats, until the next inevitable step. He'd have to confirm with me again that I had acted under his instruction. That was the moment I was waiting for, the one where his voice would commit him to his own undoing. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, he appeared at the edge of my desk. His smile was gone, replaced by the tight-lipped expression of someone trying not to show the cracks. "Daniel," he started, keeping his voice low, "about that file. You didn't actually delete it, did you?" I looked up, calm and steady. "I did exactly what you asked me to do yesterday. Deleted the payroll master encryption file. Audit logs updated." For a split second, I watched the calculation in his eyes, the desperate search for a way out, colliding with the realization that there wasn't one. He exhaled sharply through his nose, muttered something about checking another source, and walked away. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The trap had already sprung. Now all I had to do was wait for the rest of the building to hear the snap. And they would, very soon. By the time lunch hour rolled around, the tension in the air had thickened. Conversations at nearby desks were shorter, more clipped, punctuated by uneasy glances toward the glass wall of his office. He'd been pacing in there for the last 20 minutes, a phone pressed to his ear, his free hand drumming impatiently on the desk. I didn't need to hear the words to know what stage he was in, now damage control. The problem was, he was trying to put out a fire without realizing the water lines had been cut. I turned my attention back to my own monitor and pulled up the secure console once again. The empty directory stared back at me like a clean slate. It was almost poetic, years of intricate coding, meticulous security layers, and bulletproof compliance measures reduced to nothing. This wasn't an accident. This was precision. And like any precise operation, the real power wasn't in the act itself. It was in the documentation. I opened the audit trail, scrolling down to the line that mattered most. Deleted payroll master encryption file per manager instruction. The timestamp glowed next to it, perfectly aligned with the exact moment I'd pressed enter. A record immune to misinterpretation, as HR liked to call it. This wasn't hearsay. This was fact written in the company's own system logs, immutable and admissible in any meeting, court, or congressional hearing you could imagine. It reminded me of something my mentor told me in my first year, Daniel. The person who writes the record writes the ending. I'd written this one with surgical precision, knowing exactly how and when it would be read aloud. From across the floor, I caught sight of Jenna again, now accompanied by one of the senior IT leads, a guy named Mark, who'd been in the industry almost as long as I had. He glanced my way, hesitated, and then walked past without saying a word. That told me he'd read the log. That told me he knew. My phone buzzed. An internal message popped up on my screen, just a single line from Mark: "He's in trouble." I didn't reply. Instead, I took one final step to close the loop. I exported the audit log as a secure file, encrypted it with my own personal key, and emailed it to my private account. Not because I thought anyone could alter the original, but because I believe in redundancy, ironic considering the situation. If the storm got messy, I wanted my own lifeboat. With that done, I leaned back, hands folded, and let the hum of the office wash over me. It struck me how ordinary everything seemed, phones ringing, printers, whirring, the faint smell of burnt coffee drifting from the break room. It was the perfect camouflage for a moment that would later be remembered as a turning point in the company's history. And then, as if on cue, he emerged from his office. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, and the easy swagger he'd worn that morning was gone. He made a beeline for me, planting his hands on the edge of my desk. "Daniel," he said, forcing a chuckle about that file. "Maybe I was a little unclear yesterday. If it's still somewhere..." I cut him off, keeping my voice even. "It's not. You gave me a directive. I followed it. The system log reflects that." For a moment, he just stared at me. Not in anger, at least not only in anger, but in dawning realization. The kind of look people get when they realize they've stepped off a ledge and the ground is much farther away than they thought. He straightened up, muttered something about options, and walked away, his shoulders just a little more hunched than before. Inside, I felt no rush of adrenaline, no thrill of the kill. What I felt was colder, cleaner, the certainty that the chain of events was now irreversible. The keystroke had been the point of no return. Everything from here on out was just gravity doing its work. I swiveled my chair toward the window, watching the cars in the parking lot shimmer in the midday sun. Somewhere out there, people were going about their lives, oblivious to the fact that a corporate implosion was quietly building momentum a few feet from where I sat. I smiled faintly. In chess, they call it a zugzwang, a position where every move your opponent can make will only worsen their situation. That's where he was now. And all I had to do was let him keep moving. Long before yesterday's little delete the file order, the seeds for this moment had been planted. I've always believed that people show you who they are in the small things first, and if you're paying attention, you can see the shape of the bigger betrayal long before it arrives. With him, the signs were neon bright from day one. He arrived about 6 months ago, all polished smiles and overconfident handshakes, talking about streamlining operations and breaking down silos. It didn't take long to realize that streamlining meant cutting out anyone whose expertise made him feel small, and breaking down silos meant erasing the systems he didn't understand so he could replace them with cheaper, flashier alternatives that would make for nice bullet points on his quarterly review. 2 days into his tenure, he was already taking credit in department-wide emails for upgrades to the payroll system. Upgrades that were literally my work, down to the last line of code just renamed and repackaged. When I corrected him privately, he brushed it off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "We're all one team here. No need to get hung up on who did what." A month later, he stood in a meeting with the CFO and called my detailed compliance documentation paranoid redundancy. That documentation had saved us during a statewide banking outage, allowing us to reroute payments in hours instead of days. But he never mentioned that part didn't fit the narrative he wanted. Then came the benefits vendor debacle. He deliberately excluded me from the initial vendor meetings, probably thinking he'd sideline me from the technical side of the transition. But when he realized the vendor's secure data exchange couldn't be set up without my authorization, he sent me a one-line email. "Need you to handle this real quick." No acknowledgement of the oversight, no apology, just an assumption I'd quietly fix the mess. And I did, but I filed that moment away. These moments stacked up like bricks in a wall, each one another reminder of where I stood in his vision of the department. I wasn't a valued architect of the system. I was an obstacle to be navigated around, tolerated when necessary, and erased when convenient. So when he gave me the order to delete that key, it wasn't a single bad decision. It was the culmination of every disregard, every theft of credit, every time he mistook patience for weakness. I know some of you watching this have your own stories of bosses like that, the kind who smile to your face and undercut you in the next breath, the kind who think institutional knowledge is just old habits and that experience is a liability. If you've dealt with someone like that, I want you to tell me in the comments. Not just for me, because there's someone else scrolling through who needs to know they're not alone in this. Back then, I didn't act on impulse. I waited, I kept the records, I played the long game. And that's the thing, revenge isn't about the heat of the moment. It's about timing, about letting the other person build the stage for their own downfall. By the time he told me to delete the file, I already knew the rules of the game better than he did. I knew that key was irreplaceable under compliance law. I knew the recovery process would take weeks and require my written consent, and that clause was buried so deep in my contract, he'd never find it without legal digging. I knew Ite couldn't magic up a backup, because the law explicitly forbade one. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that every little slight he thought he'd gotten away with was another nail in the coffin he'd just climbed into. As I sat there that morning watching the slow ripple of panic spread through payroll and IT, I thought back to each of those moments. They didn't sting anymore. They felt resolved, like chapters in a book that had finally reached the payoff. This wasn't petty. This wasn't spite for spite's sake. This was the principle that if you walk into a system you don't understand and start tearing down the supports, you'd better be ready when the roof comes down. And this time, I wasn't going to be the one holding it up. People outside the payroll world like to think a system is just a bunch of files and buttons, press the right one, and the money flows again. But those of us who live in this space know the truth. Payroll systems are like nuclear facilities. You don't just restart them, and you definitely don't mess with the controls unless you know exactly what you're doing. The master encryption key was the linchpin, the heart that kept every other part of the system alive. Without it, the processor might as well have been a vault door with no combination. That was by design, my design crafted to meet the strictest federal and state compliance laws in the US. This wasn't some overkill security quirk. It was a legal necessity. Years ago, after a near disaster with a rogue contractor, I'd worked with legal and compliance to hardwire a safeguard into the company policy. The key could only be regenerated with my written authorization. And written didn't mean an email or a verbal okay, it meant ink on paper, physical signature, logged and stored under legal lock and key. This safeguard had passed every audit, every inspection, every attempt from some overeager executive to streamline the process. And because the law also forbade storing that key in a cloud backup on external drives or in any replicated form, the only copy existed in that one secured location, the one I had just emptied. As I watched the clock creep past 11:30 that morning, I imagined IT bouncing from one dead end to another. They'd try the local mirrors, empty. They'd try the compliance vault, not there by law. They'd look for an offsite archive, doesn't exist. The answer would be the same no matter where they searched, gone. I knew this because I'd designed it to be bulletproof against exactly the kind of casual recklessness my boss had just demonstrated. My goal back then wasn't to wield power. It was to protect the company from itself. Funny how that same protection was now the very thing about to bring him down. I glanced toward his office and saw him hunched over his desk phone pressed to his ear, his free hand raking through his hair. The morning swagger was gone, replaced with the frantic body language of a man who just realized the problem was bigger than he could spin. If you've ever had a boss who thought they could strong-arm their way through every challenge, you know that look. It's the moment they realize there's no shortcut, no magic workaround, no one else to blame. They're in the chair, and the consequences are strapped in with them. If you've seen that look before, drop your story in the comments. I want to read them, and I guarantee someone else in this community needs to hear them too. Mark from IT walked by my desk on his way to the server room. He didn't make eye contact, but his shoulders were stiff, his pace brisk. That told me the search had already hit the wall. And when you're dealing with payroll, every minute after that wall feels like an hour. I opened the secure console one more time, staring at the empty slot where the key had been. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel fear. What I felt was inevitability. Like watching a chessboard where every move had already been decided and the end game was just playing itself out. To anyone else, the missing file would look like an accident, a blip, maybe even a tragic oversight. But to those who understood the architecture and to those who'd read the audit log, it was exactly what it appeared to be, an executed order, carried out to the letter, with every safeguard and every trace preserved for review. I closed the window, leaned back, and let my eyes drift over the rest of the office. Phones still rang, people still typed. Somewhere in the break room, a microwave beeped. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath it the foundation had already been cut. And the man who ordered it? He was still sitting there, completely unaware that the clock on his career was now ticking loud enough for the whole building to hear. By early afternoon, the office was humming at its usual rhythm, but to me every sound carried a different meaning. The ringing phones were ticking clocks, the clack of keyboards a countdown. The system looked alive to everyone else, but I knew its heartbeat had already stopped. That was the beauty of this move. On the surface, nothing had changed. Payroll data was still visible, the interface still loaded, and all the dashboards looked normal. But the moment anyone tried to push a payment through the system would seize up like an engine with no oil. From that point on, there was no bypass, no manual override. I decided it was time to finish the last step of the operation, securing my evidence outside company walls. I reopened the audit log, highlighted the exact line deleted payroll master encryption file, per manager instruction, and exported it as a secure encrypted file. I took the extra step of adding a checksum verification, something that would prove the file hadn't been altered by even a single byte. Then I composed a short email to my personal account. No explanations, no commentary, just the file attached with the subject line, "For records." I hit send and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen until the sent notification popped up. That single action meant that no matter what happened next, spin denial, or some corporate sleight of hand, the truth was now locked away in a place only I could touch. After that, I shut everything down. Not just locking the screen, but a full system shutdown. The hum of the fan faded to silence and the little LED power light went dark. My desk now looked like I was heading out for the day, though it was only 1:30 in the afternoon. I leaned back, folding my hands loosely in my lap, and let my eyes wander across the floor. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that I could be the calmest person in the building, while the real storm was still invisible to everyone else. A coworker passing by glanced at my black screen. Heading out early, she asked with a smile. "Not yet," I said, keeping my voice light. "Just getting some air." What I didn't tell her was that I wanted to be present when the first cracks appeared, when the error messages started showing up on payroll terminals, when the calls started flooding in from branch managers, when the CFO's phone started buzzing nonstop. From my vantage point, I could see into his office. He was standing now hunched over his desk, talking into the phone with one hand pressed hard against his forehead. Even from here, his frustration was obvious. Short, sharp gestures, quick glances at the monitor, the restless shifting of weight from one foot to the other. It was almost artistic, like watching a tightly wound watch spring uncoil in slow motion. Every movement, every word he spoke now was just tightening the noose he'd put around his own neck. The best part was that none of this had to be hurried. The system wasn't going to collapse this very second. It would take until tomorrow's payroll run for the damage to fully reveal itself. That delay was intentional. It gave him time to act confident, to assure people everything was under control, so that when the truth hit, the fall would be harder, sharper, and entirely his. I stood up and made my way toward the window, looking out over the parking lot. Cars glinted in the late-day sun. People walked to and from their vehicles without a clue that inside these walls the most critical function of the company had already been unplugged. Sometimes winning doesn't look like charging into battle. Sometimes it's about stepping back, letting your opponent believe they've already won, and giving them enough rope to finish the job themselves. And now all I had to do was wait. It started with a shift in the atmosphere, subtle at first, like the way the air feels before a summer storm. Conversations grew shorter. Heads began turning toward the far end of the floor where the executive offices sat. You could almost feel the ripple move through the building. Then I saw her, Rachel from HR, walking briskly across the open floor with a folder tucked under one arm and her phone in the other. She wasn't smiling, and Rachel always smiled. 2 steps behind her was Tom, the CFO, a tall man with a measured stride and a reputation for never raising his voice, but still getting exactly what he wanted. Today his jaw was set, his eyes scanning the room like he was already assessing damage. They didn't head straight to my boss's office, they went to find him. And when they did, they didn't stand in the doorway to chat. They closed in like a pair of hawks zeroing in on prey. I watched from my desk as Rachel said something I couldn't hear, then turned and led the way toward the glass-walled corner office my boss liked to brag about. Tom followed, hands in his pockets, his shoulders stiff. My boss trailed after them, looking more like a student being summoned to the principal's office than the department leader he fancied himself to be. They disappeared into the office, the door closing with a soft click that seemed to echo louder than it should have. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. Somewhere, someone had already tried to run a payroll test or finalize a processing batch, and the system had spit out an error it had never given before. That message would have led them to the system logs, and those logs would have led them to one unavoidable conclusion: the key was gone and the action was logged. The thing about corporate crisis meetings is that the silence outside the room is as telling as the words inside. People walked slower near that office. Typing in the nearby cubicles softened. Even the occasional burst of laughter from the break room seemed to cut off halfway. From my seat, I had the perfect side view of their silhouettes. Tom was doing most of the talking, his posture forward, his gestures controlled but emphatic. Rachel stood to the side, arms crossed occasionally, jotting notes with deliberate precision. My boss, on the other hand, shifted his weight from foot to foot, his hands making those small, defensive motions of someone trying to downplay the seriousness of the situation. I pictured him leaning on phrases like just an old file, or we can rebuild it quickly, oblivious, or maybe just refusing to accept that neither was true. The reality was binary. Either you didn't know what the file was, which meant you were incompetent, or you did know and deleted it anyway, which made you dangerous. The meeting broke faster than I expected. Less than 10 minutes later, the door opened, and the three of them emerged. My boss's face was tight, his smirk gone. He glanced in my direction for just a moment, and I gave him nothing, no expression, no acknowledgement, just the same unreadable calm I'd worn when he gave me the order. They walked toward his desk. Tom stopped short, turned to face him, and asked, calm, flat, almost conversational, "Where is the payroll key file?" From my vantage point, I saw my boss hesitate just for a heartbeat before saying, "What payroll key file?" Tom's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. The encryption key that unlocks the payroll processing system. And there it was, the first crack in his armor. He shifted uncomfortably, then said, "Oh, that thing obsolete. I told it to be cleaned up this morning, just clutter." Rachel didn't move, didn't even blink. Tom shook his head slightly, as if physically brushing aside the excuse. "Without that file," he said slowly, "we cannot process payroll for anyone. Not tomorrow, not next week, not until it's rebuilt. And rebuilding it takes weeks. Compliance sign-off alone is a multi-step process." The silence that followed was heavy enough to press down on the entire floor. People nearby were staring at their screens, pretending not to listen while catching every word. I sat perfectly still, watching from the corner of my eye. Every sentence that left Tom's mouth was another nail in the coffin, and every response from my boss was another shovelful of dirt on top. The balance of power had shifted. He just didn't realize yet that he no longer had any. Tom didn't blink. He let the weight of his last words hang in the air, heavy and unshakable. My boss shifted again, the defensive smirk making a feeble comeback. "Well, surely there's a backup somewhere," he said, palms turned up as if the answer was obvious. "There isn't," Tom replied, his voice clipped but steady. "For security reasons, the master key is not stored in the cloud, not mirrored on external drives, and not replicated anywhere off the secure local system. That's the law. You'd know that if you'd read the compliance protocols." That landed like a gavel strike. The quiet in the office deepened, every side conversation now a whisper. I could feel the tension radiating from their corner of the room like heat from a furnace. My boss was glancing around, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Tom stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only those nearest could hear, but I was close enough to catch it. "Let's try this again," he said. "Where is it?" And my boss gave it away. No hedging, no clever rewording. "I told you," he said, his voice tightening. "I had it deleted. It was part of the cleanup initiative." There it was, the confession served on a silver platter. No interpretation needed, no wiggle room, just the raw, damning truth in his own words. Tom didn't react with triumph. He didn't need to. His expression went unreadable, his eyes flicking briefly toward Rachel, who was already jotting the words down in her notes. Everyone within earshot knew that sentence would be preserved, quoted and repeated in every meeting that followed. I sat still, hands resting loosely on my desk, eyes on my blank monitor. On the inside, though, I could feel that low hum of satisfaction, the kind you get when you know the trap has sprung exactly as planned. Now here's the thing. You might be thinking, "That's it, he's done." And you'd be right, but not in the way you think. Because when a career implodes like this, it doesn't happen in one loud explosion. It happens in stages. The confession. That's just the ignition. The real damage comes when the audience expands, when the blast radius reaches the people who sign the checks and write the press statements. And trust me, that's exactly what was about to happen. If you've been in a situation where someone finally admitted out loud to the very thing you'd been warning about when you knew their own words would be their undoing, you know that feeling. Tell me in the comments about the time you witnessed someone walk right into their own downfall. I want to see if anyone's story tops this one. The CFO turned to one of the IT leads lingering nearby. Check every storage path, now! The techs scattered, moving with the urgency of people trying to save a sinking ship. But I knew what they'd find, or rather what they wouldn't. Mark's voice carried over from the server room a few minutes later. Nothing in the mirrors, nothing in the compliance vault. Another voice chimed in. There's no off-site archive for the key. That's a compliance violation if it existed at all. With each failed report, the weight on my boss's shoulders grew heavier. He tried to hover behind the techs, offering half-baked suggestions. What about the dev server? But the answers were immediate and damning. Even if it was there, it wouldn't work. The encryption protocol is tied to the active key's unique signature. You can't just copy and paste it. His eyes darted around the room like a man trapped in a maze he didn't build. And all the while, I kept my posture relaxed, my expression unreadable, because I knew what was coming next. The problem was no longer a technical issue, it was a leadership issue. And once that label sticks in a corporate environment, it's the equivalent of blood in the water. The Shark's C-suite legal HR were already circling. What my boss didn't know was that the biggest shark in the building was on his way. You could feel it before you saw him, the shift in the air, the sudden hush that rolled across the floor like a wave pulling the tide back. When the CEO walks into your department unexpectedly, it's never for a friendly check-in. And in that moment, every person in the room straightened in their chair, as if posture alone might shield them from whatever was coming. Daniel Shaw. Our CEO wasn't a man who wasted words. He had the kind of presence that made you feel like you were under a microscope the moment his eyes landed on you. Tall, broad-shouldered, immaculately dressed, he moved with that quiet, controlled energy of someone who could detonate a situation without ever raising his voice. He didn't walk toward my desk. He didn't greet anyone. He went straight to the glass-walled conference room, gesturing to Tom Rachel, and yes, my boss, to join him. The door clicked shut and blinds were pulled halfway, just enough to give them privacy, but not enough to block out the shadow play of what was about to unfold. Through the blinds, I could see Daniel slide a laptop across the table toward my boss. The glow of the screen lit their faces in cold blue light. Tom was speaking, his hands moving in controlled arcs, laying out the chain of events, the deletion, the missing encryption key, the impossibility of restoring it in time. Rachel slid her notes forward, her pen still in hand, ready to record anything new. And then Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers laced together. He didn't look angry, that was worse. He looked patient, the kind of patience that meant he already knew. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough to piece it together. So Daniel said you gave the order to delete a file you didn't understand. My boss shifted in his seat. It was obsolete. We needed to clear space for the new systems. Daniel cut him off, his tone even. Do you know what that key controlled? Silence. That key, Daniel continued, is required by law for us to issue payroll to every employee in this company. Without it, we cannot legally disperse funds. And without disbursement, we are in violation of multiple federal and state regulations. Tom slid a printed log across the table. Here's the deletion record. Time-stamped, user authenticated. That's your ID. My boss glanced at it, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. This is being blown out of proportion. We can rebuild. Daniel didn't raise his voice, but the steel in it could have cut glass. You cannot rebuild a federal registered encryption key overnight, and the cost of compliance reissuance, hundreds of thousands of dollars. In the meantime, we face penalties, lawsuits, and a loss of trust that will take years to recover from. From outside the glass, you could see the moment my boss realized there was no escape hatch. His shoulders sank a fraction, his eyes darting toward the door like he was calculating whether walking out would be worse than staying in. Daniel's next words sealed it. You've placed this entire company in jeopardy. I'm deciding right now whether you remain an employee by the end of the day. There it was, the corporate death sentence suspended in midair. The rest of the floor was dead silent. Even people with noise-canceling headphones had pulled them down, pretending to scroll through emails while straining to catch any word that might float out when the door opened. And then, almost like a gift to every gossip-hungry ear in the building, the door did open. Daniel stepped out first, his expression unreadable. Tom followed, then Rachel. My boss trailed behind, looking pale and smaller than I'd ever seen him. Daniel didn't make an announcement. He didn't have to. He simply said all hands in the main conference room in 30 minutes. If you've ever been in an office where a meeting like that was called without warning, you know exactly what happens next. Phones buzz with quiet speculation, eyes widen, Slack threads explode under the table, And as I sat there watching my boss retreat to his office to collect himself, or maybe to start packing, I knew the next half hour would be the longest of his career. What happened in that all hands would decide everything. And trust me, you'll want to hear exactly how it played out. The main conference room had never felt smaller. By the time I walked in, nearly every seat was taken, forcing latecomers to line the walls. The hum of whispered speculation was electric people leaning toward their neighbors' eyes, darting toward the front where Daniel stood, arms folded, the kind of stillness that made you nervous just looking at him. I slipped into a spot near the back, but from where I stood, I had the perfect vantage point to watch my boss. He was at the far end of the table, posture, stiff eyes fixed on the wood grain, as if avoiding everyone's gaze might make him invisible. Spoiler, it didn't. Daniel didn't waste time. I called this meeting, he began, his voice carrying effortlessly over the crowd, because every single person in this company deserves to know why, as of this morning, your paychecks are in jeopardy. The room went silent. You could hear the faint tick of the wall clock. 3 weeks ago, Daniel continued, a critical encryption key required for us to legally and securely process payroll was deleted from our system. A few heads turned toward my boss. The people who didn't know were starting to piece things together. This deletion, Daniel said, was not the result of a system error, nor an outside breach. It was an intentional act, ordered without proper authority, understanding, or consultation with our compliance or IT departments. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. I saw jaws tighten, brows furrow. Everyone here knew how important payroll security was. Mess with that, and you mess with people's mortgages, groceries, kids' tuition. This wasn't just a technical mishap, this was personal. Daniel gestured toward Tom, who stepped forward with a small stack of papers. Here, Tom said, is the log showing exactly when, how, and by whom the deletion was executed. We have video verification from the admin console confirming the user ID involved. Tom didn't say my boss's name. He didn't have to. It was printed right there in bold black text, visible to the first 2 rows. The rest craned their necks to catch a glimpse. My boss finally looked up, his face a shade paler than when we'd last seen him. This is being presented without context, he said, his voice just loud enough to carry. We were undergoing a system cleanup. The key was tied to old infrastructure. Daniel's tone sharpened. You were told repeatedly in previous meetings that the key was active, legally required, and irreplaceable without massive cost. You ignored those warnings. Silence again, this time heavier. Daniel looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over every employee. The fallout is this: payroll will be delayed. Compliance fines will be incurred. We are working to reissue a key, but the process will not be quick. And the root cause is the reckless decision of one person who acted outside their scope. That was it, the point where speculation crystallized into certainty. I saw the recognition in people's faces, the way their eyes flicked to my boss and then back to Daniel. The judgment had been passed in their minds, even if HR hadn't stamped it yet. And then Daniel said something I didn't expect: we will recover from this. But it's going to take all of us focused, united, and clear-eyed about who we trust in leadership roles. He didn't name him. He didn't need to. The implication was as sharp as any firing notice. As the meeting wrapped, people didn't linger to chat. They filed out quietly, processing what they'd just heard. My boss stayed seated for a long moment, staring at the table, like maybe if he kept still enough, time would reverse. But time doesn't reverse. And in 30 years of corporate life, I'd learned one truth: when the CEO calls you out without raising his voice, without pointing a finger, it's already over. The rest is just paperwork. What happened next wasn't just the end of his job. It was the kind of public dismantling that no LinkedIn post could spin, and I had a front row seat to the aftermath. The meeting emptied like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving only the scattered sound of chairs scraping against the floor and the low shuffle of feet in the hallway. I stayed put for a moment, letting the crowd thin, my eyes still on my boss. He hadn't moved since the last person filed out. He sat rigid, hands folded in front of him, the picture of someone trying to calculate their next move while the chessboard was already tilted against them. I'd seen a lot in my years here: departmental shakeups, surprise resignations, even a hostile takeover. But there was something different about this. It wasn't just a personnel issue. It felt like a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. As I finally stood to leave, Tom caught my eye. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, the kind that carried a whole conversation. It's done. Just a matter of formality now. In the hallway, the air buzzed with hushed voices. People clustered in twos and threes, their heads bent together, like school kids swapping secrets. Did you see his face? I heard the fines could hit 7 figures. Payroll delay. My rent's due Friday. The mix of shock, anger, and grim fascination was palpable. I ducked into the break room for coffee more for a moment to think than for caffeine. That's when Rachel walked in holding a folder like it was made of glass. She looked around to make sure we were alone before she said, "You should know. There's more." More, I asked, my voice low. She slid into the seat across from me. The deletion wasn't just reckless, it was deliberate. He was told the key was tied to active payroll, and he signed off on it anyway without documenting any reason. That means HR can classify it as gross misconduct. Immediate termination, no severance. I leaned back, processing that. Why would he do something that stupid? Rachel's expression was tight. That's the part I can't prove yet. But there's a rumor he's been talking to one of our competitors, the one that's been poaching mid-level managers for months. If they timed their offer right, a payroll delay could weaken morale here just enough for them to lure more people away. It was an ugly possibility, but in corporate politics, ugly often turned out to be true. I felt the weight of the story pressing at the edges of my mind. This wasn't just a blunder, it could be sabotage. And if that was the case, the next move from leadership wouldn't just be a termination. It would be a full-scale internal investigation with legal teeth. That's why I'm telling you, don't click away now. The real twist is still ahead, and trust me, it's one you won't see coming. By mid-afternoon, an email went out from HR effective immediately. Boss's name is no longer with the company. Interim department leadership will be announced shortly. It was short, clinical, and devoid of any emotion, but everyone knew it was the end game. I passed his office on my way back from the printer. The door was open, the desk half cleared. A small cardboard box sat in the center, the universal symbol of corporate exile. He wasn't there. That's when Daniel stepped out from a nearby conference room. "Got a second?" he asked. His tone was conversational, but there was an edge under it. "Of course," I said, following him inside. "I know you've had to pick up a lot of slack these past few weeks," he began. "And I also know you were the one who flagged the discrepancies in the payroll logs before this all blew up. That didn't go unnoticed." It took me a second to realize what he was hinting at. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," he interrupted, "that people who protect this company deserve to be in positions where they can keep doing that. It wasn't a promotion offer, not yet. But it was the first move in a new game, and I could feel the board shifting under my feet. The thing about corporate checkmates is that they rarely happen in one move. This was a chain reaction, and my boss's fall was just the opening act. The real maneuver was still in motion. And here's the part I can't stop thinking about. If the sabotage theory was true, then someone else in this building had been pulling strings all along, and they weren't finished yet." By the next morning, the office had that strange post-storm quiet, like the air was still charged, but everyone was pretending to go back to normal. The HR email had done its job in making the termination seem clean and final, but under the surface, people were restless. The truth was, you don't fire a department head over one mistake unless there's a deeper rot. I was in early, hoping to get a head start on the backlog the payroll chaos had created when Rachel appeared in my doorway. She shut it behind her and spoke in a tone meant for my ears alone. "They found something," she said. I set my coffee down. "What kind of something?" She handed me a printed report, IT's deep dive audit of the weeks leading up to the deletion. My eyes caught on a detail halfway down the page, multiple encrypted file transfers to an outside IP address. The kicker. The transfers were initiated under a temporary admin account. But that account had been created by my boss's login. "This isn't just policy violation," I murmured. "This is theft." Rachel nodded grimly. "If payroll data was in those transfers, it's a federal offense. Daniel's already looping in outside counsel." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it settling over me. Suddenly, the whole thing clicked. The deletion wasn't about cleanup. It was about covering tracks. Wipe the key, disrupt payroll, stall everything long enough to hide the fact that sensitive data had walked out the door. And that meant whoever was on the other end of those file transfers now had the kind of leverage that could cripple us if it went public. Before I could process more, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You're asking too many questions. Stop before you end up like him." I stared at it for a long second. The timing was too perfect to be random. "Rachel," I said, holding up my phone, "I think I just got my first threat." Her face tightened. "Then we need to be careful about who we talk to." That was the moment I realized the danger wasn't over with my boss's firing, it had just shifted. If there was someone else pulling strings, they were still here, still watching, still capable of making people disappear from this company with a few keystrokes and a quiet meeting. And if you've stuck with me this far, trust me, you're going to want to hear what came next. It's the kind of twist that makes you rethink every conversation, every handshake, every friendly smile you've seen in an office hallway. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me into his office. The blinds were drawn, the door locked behind me. "I need someone I can trust," he said simply. "This investigation just got bigger. It's not just about payroll, it's about the fact that we may have a corporate mole. And I think you've already been closer to them than you realize." That last sentence hit me harder than I expected. My mind replayed every late-night email exchange, every project where I'd been asked to loop in certain people, every time I'd been casually CC'd on something sensitive. Patterns began to emerge, and one name kept surfacing in my memory. But naming them out loud without proof would be suicide. So instead I just said, "Tell me what you need me to do." Daniel leaned forward, sliding a thin folder across the desk. "Start with this, quietly. If what's in here is correct, then the person we're looking for has been using this company as a staging ground for months. And they're still sitting in this building." I took the folder, feeling the weight of it in my hands, not just paper, but the possibility of ending someone's career, maybe even sending them to prison. Walking back to my desk, I couldn't shake the thought this was no longer about cleaning up a mess. This was about playing the final moves in a game I hadn't even realized I'd been a part of, and making sure I wasn't the next piece to be knocked off the board. I didn't open the folder until I was back in my apartment that night. I'd learned enough about corporate espionage to know that even a glance at the wrong file on company premises could put you on someone's radar. The folder wasn't thick, just a few stapled reports, some login logs, and a printout of an org chart with one name circled in red. When I saw the name, my stomach sank. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone I'd barely interacted with. It was Paul Henderson, our senior operations analyst. The guy who'd mentored me when I first joined, who'd helped me navigate my first office politics disaster, who'd once covered for me when I was out sick. If Daniel was right, Paul wasn't just a helpful colleague, he was the mole. I read through the logs. Over the last 6 months, Paul had accessed restricted databases he had no business touching. The timestamps lined up with the mysterious file transfers Rachel had mentioned. And every time there was a shadow account running parallel, disguised to look like routine system maintenance. The deletion of the payroll encryption key wasn't my boss's idea alone. Paul had been the one to initiate the request for data cleanup, phrased just vaguely enough to get the green light. My boss had been the blunt instrument. Paul was the hand guiding it. The realization hit me like a gut punch. My boss's firing had been necessary, but it wasn't the endgame. It was misdirection, a sacrificial pawn to shield the real player. The next day, I came in early, again folder in my bag. My plan was to give Daniel my preliminary read before the morning meetings. But as I passed the break room, I saw Paul already there, coffee in hand, leaning casually against the counter. "Morning," he said, smiling like always. "Heard you've been busy these last few days." His tone was friendly, but there was an edge to it, like he was probing for how much I knew. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Just trying to keep the wheels turning." He sipped his coffee. "That's good. You know, in this place, the people who ask too many questions usually find themselves reassigned." It was subtle, but it landed exactly as he meant it. A warning. This is why you can't leave yet, because the final move is about to happen, and it's not just going to end one career, it's going to end the game entirely. When I met Daniel later, I laid out what I'd found. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. "So you're telling me," he said at last, "that your boss was a patsy, that Paul's been orchestrating this for months?" "Yes," I said, "and if those file transfers contained what I think they did, he's already positioned himself to sell the data or use it as leverage." Daniel leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Then we can't just confront him. We need him to make the next move in a way we can document. Otherwise, he walks." It was a risky plan, but it made sense. Corporate justice isn't about catching someone in the act. It's about proving it to a standard that leaves no room for appeal. We set the trap. It quietly restored a decoy database with fabricated but realistic payroll records. Access to it was restricted to a short list, including Paul. And then we waited. That night, I could barely sleep. Every creak in the building made me think of the text message. Every shadow across my blinds looked like someone watching. The next morning, the alert came in: unauthorized access to the decoy database. Logged in from Paul's workstation. Data transferred to the same outside IP address as before. The checkmate was seconds away. The moment the alert hit Daniel's inbox, he called me into his office. His voice was calm, but his eyes had that sharp focus you only see when someone knows the final move is on the board. "It's him," Daniel said. "We've got the access logs, the transfer records, and the timestamps. This is airtight." We looped in legal and HR. The plan was simple: bring Paul into a meeting under the guise of discussing process improvements, confront him with the evidence, and have security on standby. But Daniel added one more condition: he wanted me in the room. At first, I hesitated. My part in this had been strategic behind the scenes. Being in that room meant standing face to face with someone who had not only tried to sabotage the company, but had also threatened me personally. Then I thought about that text message about my boss being thrown under the bus, about every employee who had been burned by payroll errors over the past year, and I said yes. When Paul walked in, he had that same easy smile. But the second Daniel slid the first printout across the table, his expression froze. "What's this?" he asked. Daniel leaned forward. "That's a log of your system access from the past 6 months, including last night." Paul's eyes flicked to me. "You've been digging." I didn't look away. "I've been doing my job." For a moment, it looked like he might try to bluff his way out. Then Daniel pulled out the second sheet, the IP address matches. The decoy database? The fake payroll data? "You walked right into it," Daniel said. "And we have everything we need." Paul's jaw tightened. "You think you can prove this in court?" Daniel didn't flinch. "We won't have to. You're done here. Security's waiting outside. HR will follow up about your severance, if any." There was a beat of silence, and then Paul pushed back his chair. He didn't make a scene, didn't shout. But as he stood, he leaned in close to me. "This isn't over," he whispered. I met his gaze. "For you it is." Security escorted him out. Just like that, the months of quiet sabotage were over. Payroll could be rebuilt, trust could be mended, and the shadow that had hung over every conversation in that office was finally gone. As I walked back to my desk, there was a strange stillness, like the building itself was exhaling. People were whispering, glancing toward the elevators where Paul had just disappeared. But no one asked me what had happened. They didn't have to. I sat down, opened my laptop, and started the process of restoring the real payroll database. It would take weeks to fix everything Paul had broken, but at least now the work mattered. And here's where I'll leave you with one thought in corporate chess: sometimes the only way to win is to stop playing defense and make the move that ends the game. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about catching a thief. It was about protecting every single person whose name was on that payroll list, from the executives to the interns. If you've been following this story, you've seen how one person's quiet persistence can unravel a scheme that looked untouchable. And if you've ever faced a toxic boss, a hostile work environment, or a system stacked against you, remember there's always a move left. Before you go, I've got another story that will make your jaw drop, about a woman who turned her own wrongful termination into the ultimate corporate revenge. Click over to that video now. You won't believe how she flipped the script. When the dust finally settled, the office began to feel different. It wasn't just that Paul was gone, it was the absence of that constant tension, the subtle glances over shoulders, the guarded conversations. People were laughing again in the break room. Deadlines were still tight, but the undercurrent of mistrust had lifted. I realized something important during those quiet weeks of rebuilding payroll. Justice in the corporate world doesn't always look like a dramatic courtroom scene or a headline-making scandal. Sometimes it's simply the space to do your job without fear, to speak, without second-guessing who might be listening. Daniel stopped by my desk one afternoon holding 2 coffees. "You did good," he said simply. And in that moment, the long nights, the risks, the stress, it all felt worth it. I didn't get a promotion for what I'd done. There was no bonus check or plaque with my name on it. But what I did get was the knowledge that I'd helped protect dozens of people's livelihoods, that I'd refused to let intimidation silence me. And that was enough. I also learned that walking away isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strength, choosing which battles to fight, which games to play, and when to step back, knowing you've already made your move. Life outside of work started to feel lighter too. I slept better. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in months. And slowly I stopped replaying that whisper, "This isn't over," because I knew deep down it was. If there's one thing I'd leave you with, it's this: protect your integrity like it's your most valuable asset. Because in the long run it is. Everything else can be rebuilt, but once you give that away, it's gone.